Hi, I'm Don Lupo. I'm Director of Content and Marketing for ThinkLA, and I'm here with Jim Baudino from Mary Jane Media. Jim, would you want to go through a little bit about what it took to get this cannabis event going?
Sure. This has been in the works for 2 years. I've been with ThinkLA for 5 years. I served as heading up all the automotive events, so I worked at Toyota for 10 years prior to moving to Mary Jane Media. And so I thought that this was something that was extremely important for the ThinkLA community to understand what's going on in the cannabis world, because it is impacting everyone in the advertising and marketing landscape.
Yeah, you know, we've been talking to Jim for 2 years. We've been talking to people in the industry and in the city of Los Angeles. You know, this is going to be a $32 billion industry by 2020 across the country, and the legalization and I guess all the ins and outs of not just marketing this, but who pays for it and how. We want to make sure that our membership has all the information they need to prepare themselves for when that happens.
You know, in 2012, the Denver Post, on the eve of the vote for the first state to legalize recreational cannabis, their editorial said, vote no. They told everybody in the state of California to vote no on legalization, and then about 6 months later, they launched the Cannabis, which is a very wonderful website that talks about cannabis and promotes cannabis. And so we see, you know, this propaganda from the media, it may be winding down, but it took a really long time, and it didn't change until public opinion changed, and they didn't jump into this space until they saw some money to be made. So whatever angle you're coming into this from, you know, my first bit of advice before we talk to this amazing panel is, you know, come in for the right reasons, be humble, and understand the real power of the media and use it in a positive way. Just a show of hands, how many people in the audience have ever advertised or marketed or helped promote a product that you didn't actually believe in? Okay, we have a lot of honest people here, and that's okay. And here's the good news. This is a product you can believe in, okay? This is a plant that, thank you, has saved the lives of many, many people that I know personally, and millions of people around the world. It can be a catalyst to personal transformation. It's an incredible alternative to alcohol and pharmaceutical drugs, and it makes ice cream taste fucking amazing. So I say that from some experience. I've been writing about cannabis since 2002. I was with High Times for a long time. I'm a frequent contributor to Vice. One of my Vice colleagues is here. We worked together on a show called Bong, Appetit. I worked on Weedakit. So this is a long journey for me. And I'm very excited to talk to this panel because we have some very diverse viewpoints and people who came to this from legacy media, from the LA Times, from Vice, a place that's not necessarily cannabis media, but leans into that subject and reports honestly and has been rewarded for doing that. And from a whole new form of media that wasn't even around when I started with this, but that effectively gets this message out to people and has found a very big audience from that. So my first question is really just to each of you, how did your journey intersect with cannabis and media? How did you combine those two things, and why is it something that you wanted to stick with? And let's start with Abdullah.
Right, sure. So that's interesting. So my name's Abdullah S, and I'm a total pothead, and I've been for a long time. And I host a show called Bong Appetit and produce that as well, and you know, worked on a number of other shows. Thank you. With my man David. And actually, so you know, David has been kind of my cannabis journalism and media mentor since like very early in my career, and you know, sort of showed me that you can actually be a cannabis journalist. Before that, I was covering mostly electronic music for Vice, and you know, that was sort of my thing. And you know, I found a lot of inspiration in music, but you know, and in food when I was writing about that. But you know, I never realized that the very, you know, what I consider one of the sources of my inspiration, or one of the things that really inspires me to be creative, you know, could actually be the topic or the category of my coverage. And that was when I started writing a column called Weedicket, which was on Vice, which started back in 2012. And, Bean was like the first guy to be like, there's an entire world to cover here, right? And I feel like the point that we met at was, the crossover between a lot of activist journalism, right? This like the stuff you engaged with at High Times for such a long time. And, and then this sort of more celebratory form of journalism that we're all kind of participating in now, like, Bong Appetit, when we were doing it as a web series for a long time, it was really about saying that, all right, we're past this point, right? We're past the point of arguing with you and saying that, it's good or whatever. We're accepting that, we're moving on. And in fact, the point about Vice, I think, is a really interesting one, because this is a place that, primarily for a long time was kind of a news organization, right? Despite the bent or style or tone of the type of news that you're getting. And in fact, the news coverage of cannabis on Vice and Vice News does not garner nearly the amount of impact that our shit does, right? It's kind of crazy that, but, go figure, people would rather interact with or consume content that's just like happy, fun, and has to do with weed and, paint this picture of our little fantasy world, than watching something that's like, really trying hard to say that you've thought about this wrong the whole time and is like pointing the finger at you being like, change your mind about it, right? So, we've like all taken all different approaches at this, I'm sure. And, we sort of are starting to find our footing with let's just live in the world that we want to live in, right?
I'm Jarrett Moreno from Attention. We're a company that covers content that we think is worth people's attention. And one of the biggest topics for us since we started the company about 3 years ago has been cannabis. Everything from the medical benefits and potential, which we've talked about a lot tonight, from mental health to physical illnesses and ailments. The opioid issue is obviously a huge one, and really rebranding cannabis in many ways as an anti-gateway drug is something that we've created a lot of content around, because we have had sort of the reefer madness narrative dating back to the New York Times 90, 100 years ago, which needs to really be flipped on its head, because you see a lot of interesting cases all around the country right now where people who are addicted to opioids, and we see the death rates from that, are actually using cannabis in many instances to wean themselves off. So those are extremely interesting stories from a medical perspective. From a moral perspective, we have a huge prison issue in this country, as many of you have probably heard. The US has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. And the largest percentage of those are in for nonviolent drug offenses, and they're disproportionately young men of color. So that has a huge, obviously, moral implication. And then economically, states like California stand to have cannabis be a $6 billion or so industry. Only, I think, $2 billion of that is out in the open as medical right now. There's a huge industry that's totally unregulated. Those are huge tax benefits in states like Colorado, soon to be states like California. And then personally, my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer, and my whole life was an attorney. She was one of the first and only female partners at her law firm for my entire life. And one of the only things that gave her the strength to go into work every day and to eat enough to fight and be actively part of her own treatment cycles was actually using cannabis. And I'm from Washington, D.C., where cannabis was legal, but there were no dispensaries set up. And that was a huge issue for my family personally, and part of my own sort of personal journey. I think I probably started smoking cannabis around the time you probably started writing about it, approximately. So thanks for your...
Wait, I sold you that eighth, right? I remember.
Exactly. So, and Attention has received more than 1 billion video views on cannabis content in the last less than 12 months. So, we're talking obviously to an audience that is interested in reaching a lot of the young people that we reach, that a lot of us here, I think, are reaching around this topic. This is a industry and an issue that already exists in people's lives. This is part of people's lives. And whether you're engaging with it or not, it's going to be the case. And the brands who recognize that soonest are going to see the most success and authentically be able to reach huge audiences, because the train is leaving the station on this issue.
So thanks for having me. It's really fun to be here. I often think that I could do a whole series on just the number of cannabis conferences that go on every week all over this state and country. There's so many of them. I'm Robin Abcarian. I'm a columnist for the Los Angeles Times. I'm the legacy media, I guess, on the panel. I'm the oldest person on the panel. When I was coming up, we called them lids, not eights. I often say I'm not a pot person. I'm more of a Scotch and Chardonnay person. But I come from a family of huge pot smokers and users. And it took me until a couple of years ago to really start taking the industry seriously. I became interested mostly because I knew that Prop 64 was going to be on the ballot, and I thought there was a good chance that it was going to pass. So I set out as a columnist who writes about the state of California, politics, culture, and whatever I feel like, to educate our readers about cannabis, to help them decide whether they wanted to vote to legalize it recreationally or not. So I asked readers, what are you interested in? They really wanted to know, they wanted primers on marijuana. They wanted to know about the medical issues. They wanted to know about, what it's like to drive under the influence, whether kids should be smoking, what legalization means, for the state's finances, what it means for them. So I sort of gave myself this big portfolio to write about whatever I wanted. Readers really responded. I would say that my editors were not obstructive, but not particularly supportive. I think, and I see this unfortunately continuing to this day. I've been writing memo after memo after memo saying to them, we need to get some of this pot money that's out there. Why should, the alternative papers or the San Francisco Chronicle or other publications realize, the money that's going to be generated by the advertising and marketing of this newly legalized substance? So far, I would say my pleas have fallen on sort of deaf ears, but I'm hoping that will change. One of the things that I think I've taken it upon myself to look into is how pot affects kids. And I've written several columns about how, children should be kept away from pot. I think you were at a conference with me in downtown Los Angeles recently, where I was talking about that, how I'd interviewed the head of the Neuropsychiatric Institute at UCLA about the many kids he sees who come in the throes of terrible episodes, often because of pot. And I said, I think we all agree we don't think it's good for children to smoke pot, for adolescents to smoke pot. And somebody in the back of the room stood up and said, pot was the only thing that got me through high school, so fuck you.
Was that me?
That might have been you, David.
That was unkind. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that.
Anyway, I write about cannabis for a mainstream audience. I write for the kind of people who read the newspaper, people who may not have the level of expertise on the subject that your readers do. And I'm interested in trends, products, business opportunities. I kind of cover the gamut. I mean, I don't know if all of you know this, but every city and county in the state of California is right now deciding how they want to legalize pot, whether they want to legalize it for commercial distribution. So there is just amazing amounts of pot-related news all over the state. It's like drinking from a fire hose as a reporter who's covering the subject. And I just hope to do my readers justice covering this amazing new industry.
Thank you. So, despite my unkind shouting from the back of the room, I want to give Robin some real props because I wrote a book last year, How to Smoke Pot Properly. I probably did about 20 legacy media interviews, and she was the only reporter new to this beat who asked me questions and engaged with me in a way that I might actually have something to teach her. as somebody who's been at this quite a while. And the issue that gets to me is trust. And if you want to enter this cannabis world, whether as a media company, as an advertiser, as a marketer, you need to understand that that trust is a prerequisite to any kind of relationship with this culture. Cannabis people don't trust the media because, as I said, we've been through 100 years of propaganda. We don't trust the government because they've kicked our doors down and shot our dogs and arrested us. We don't trust the medical establishment because we've always known that this plant is an incredible medicine, and they've always denied us and wanted to give us shitty pills instead. So my question to the, yeah. You're not clapping for shitty pills. You're clapping for the general sentiment. So, my one bit of advice before I ask this, how do you build this trust to the panel, is my bit of advice is work with somebody who knows what the fuck they're talking about. And if somebody tells you, I've been in the cannabis world a long time, man, late 2015. Well, that's fucking ridiculous, okay? And if you are new, whether professionally you're new, maybe you've been smoking a long time and professionally you're new, maybe you're completely new. If you have professional skills, if you have insight, you have something to add, but please bring a little humility along with that. And please listen to the voices of the thought leaders in this world and respect that. But for each of you guys, how have, coming from very different angles, how have you built that trust with an audience over time?
Right. I think that's a really good, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that trust is totally the cornerstone of this type of coverage, not only for access, but also in terms of your readers. And the way that I sort of went about it is my first content franchise in cannabis, which was the Weedicate column. It started out as sort of in jokes about various etiquettes around cannabis, doing corners and whatever, things like that. And then very quickly it turned into every week just me telling a story from my life that had something to do with cannabis, right? And we all of a certain age, have come from this world where we lived in the shadows, and we sort of developed these microcultures around cannabis with our friends and our little cohorts. And so talking about that stuff in the open, on a major platform, I guess, if Vice was at the time a major platform, and having people read that and see, look, here's a story that's, not to toot my own horn, but fairly well written, I suppose, right? Hopefully. And that it's something that's engaging. It's a funny story. I took my inspiration from David Sedaris. If you read old Weedicate columns, I basically completely jacked his style, right? Which is this personable sort of storytelling thing. But in that, being able to have people read something on a reputable website and be wow, that's a story just like one that I had, that was how I first built the trust. I mean, years later, I did an episode of a show called Black Market on Viceland with Michael K. Williams, and it was all about deep web drug dealers, right? Now, these guys aren't just dealing in pot, they're dealing in all kinds of shit that's pretty illicit and pretty illegal. But the only reason those guys talked to me is because they were I read Weedicate and you're ahead. You know what I mean? You're cool. You're not gonna come in and whatever, have the cops on me suddenly or whatever. And that was sort of, I came at this whole thing because I really, truly, deep down inside, I love cannabis. You know what I mean? I really love it. It's a part of my life every single day. It has been since I was a teenager. It's the foundation of every friendship and relationship I've ever had. You know what I mean? So it's which is...
He's not kidding.
Yeah, so, I think that when you make content with that love in your heart, not to sound like a total hippie, but it's true. You make it with love, people will accept it with love and consume it. And, you don't have to be a cannabis user, for example, to show people that you really care, that you really want to learn or understand, right? It's it's all about your tone and your approach and not necessarily your experience. So, that's how I'd go about it.
I'll also say from our perspective, Attention looks at the various issues we cover as essentially a rolling narrative. And even if you're a columnist at a newspaper, or if you're a host of a show, you want to build that same sort of rolling narrative type mentality with your audience, where they know that you're going to help them sort of navigate a complicated topic like marijuana legalization, which is a complicated topic for people from, as we've heard tonight, a policy, legal, marketing standpoint. It's extremely complicated. There are ethical issues, there are business issues, but the truth is that audiences, especially younger audiences, we know overwhelmingly support legalization across the political spectrum, across the geographic spectrum. We know that they are talking about cannabis, they are consuming cannabis, it is part of their lives. And while the business side of this is just starting to come out of the shadows, brands, I think, have a big opportunity to be authentically part of that conversation. It's very easy for Attention to find marketing partners around climate change and mental health and physical health and wellness. It's harder, candidly, around cannabis. Not because there isn't a huge audience that cares about it. I mean, for us, 1 billion video views is, that's a lot of people who really care about this content and want to share it and engage with it and comment on it. But finding brands who really want to come out and say, I know that audiences care about this topic. I know that younger consumers in particular care about this topic, but all generations do. And we want to be part of that conversation from the very early days. And that will help elevate not only the level of discourse, but the amount of content that people can create covering all these topics.
You talk about trust. It's interesting. I decided when I started writing about cannabis that I would always take it seriously, that I would not make shitty puns, that I would never write about Cheech and Chong. And I think just having that kind of serious approach and being very curious about something that I knew I didn't know anything about, really, sort of has helped me, give me entree to worlds I never thought I would be able to be part of. And, although the transition from the black market to the green market, what do we call it? White market, green market, whatever.
The white market.
Has
Freedom.
been happening for a long, has been happening for a long time. I have spent quite a bit of time in Northern California in the Emerald Triangle in Mendocino and Humboldt County. And those are places where there is a culture of deep mistrust and paranoia for obvious reasons, because people have made such huge sacrifices to produce what they truly believe is medicine that helps people, and in fact is. So I thought it would be very difficult to sort of penetrate those worlds, to get into those farms and talk to those farmers. But what I have found remarkably is that people want to talk about what they do, and they want to talk about this amazing substance that's going mainstream and legal. And I think once you make it clear that you're not there to make reefer madness jokes or stoner jokes, that it's something that it's become very easy for me to cover, and not just easy for me to cover, but I'm beating back all the pitches that I get every day, because I don't just write about cannabis, I write about lots of other stuff, so I can't devote myself only to this subject. But when people do pitch me, the pitches that I respond most to are the ones that say, I think I have an interesting story for you, but also I'd really just like to be a source for you if you need information about this, about dispensaries or about production methods, or if you want me to help you find other sources for a particular story that you're working on, think of me. I was at a panel a few months ago, and I think it was Gaynell Rogers from Harborside up in Oakland, who opened the media discussion by saying that one of the cardinal rules of PR and marketing for news purposes is just because you exist and just because you have a product doesn't mean anybody's going to be interested in writing about it. And that's, I think, the mistake that a lot of cannabis marketers make. They come at you, people like me, and say, hey, I have a new kind of cannabis candy bar. Hey, I have a new kind of vape machine. Write about me. And it's like, well, what is this? Does this further a narrative? Is it part of a trend? Will my readers find it anything other than just slightly incremental new news? I'm not, like a high time specialist. So my readers are not going to care that there's a new vape pen that delivers whatever. I can't even know the terminology. But they will care, for example, that ocean-grown Extracts has bought a prison in Coalinga and is reviving a whole town because the town decided to sell its closed prison to this extract maker. That, to my readers, is fascinating news. Got off on a tangent, sorry.
That's an occupational hazard, getting off on a tangent, so don't worry about it. Well, I like to say, you know, I started in cannabis as a journalist in an era when people would often ask me to get in the trunk of their car to drive up to their grow room so I couldn't incriminate them. And now I occasionally meet with CEOs to consult on their, you know, whatnot, and I'll let you decide which one is more fun of an afternoon. I know what I prefer. But what that really gets into is this question of where are we going to go next? Because we know the trajectory. We know the way the arrow is facing. And I think that, you know, in listening to the panel, we all know there's a huge audience for cannabis media. There always has been. It's just been underserved until now. And we know that there's this incredible culture to cover, these amazing stories, whether it's about the medical benefits, whether it's about the injustice of prohibition that continues. I mean, I've been writing about this for 15 years, and as Robin said, you get so many pitches, and even the ones that you want to write about, there's just too much. And so, but that third aspect of how the media works, and what everyone here is an expert in, is how do we bring the marketing and the brands and the advertisers into this? Because, you know, when I start back in that trunk of the car days with High Times, the most frequently asked question was, do you guys just sit around all day and smoke weed? And the answer was no, a lot of the times we stand up. And the second most common question was, why don't you guys just like get Visine to like take a full page ad? And it's like, because they're cowards. And because they believe that that will hurt their bottom line and nothing else is important. But I think that's changing. We're obviously seeing cannabis brands starting to advertise, and we only have a few minutes left, but what's your advice for the audience that clearly wants to be involved? How do you convince your boss that this isn't going to burn down the barn and end things as you know it, and that it's actually a path to a huge new business opportunity?
Right.
If I can jump in.
yeah.
I'm going to change the order here.
Yeah, no, it's
Cool.
all good.
Just
You're
for a second.
radical.
Exactly. You know, so we've thought about this a lot because it is an issue that it is harder to find brands and advertisers who want to be around this kind of content. But we all know that advertising is changing. I don't think that's breaking news. I don't think I'm going to see that up there in a second. And the way that younger consumers in particular are engaging with and finding loyalty with brands is finding brands that stand for something. And I think that's been especially true over the last few years, even in the last few weeks, if we've seen what's happened politically in America and CEOs, you know, making their political perspectives known. And increasingly, younger people are looking for brands that will stand for something. I think if Visine is too scared to run that ad and some competitor steps in and does it, I think they will win brand affinity and they will win customers.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, an interesting thing that I sort of, you know, carry when making content is that, like, okay, you know, a lot of people look at Bong Appetit, right? And they're like, oh shit, that's the first thing of its kind that's like, you know, it's like a high quality, like high produced show. It's not a very expensive show, right? I mean, it's a cooking show. We're essentially on location, but it's like where we spend money, right? I think that's where other media makers within cannabis, so if you're a brand that's sponsoring that kind of content or you're making your own content or whatever, look at how you're spending that money. And this is like my main piece of advice for cannabis content, because I want to see cannabis content blossom. I want to pass the torch. I want to see people make lots of shows that exceed Bong Appetit and Weedicket and all the other ones, right? So with that, I mean, what it's about is that, like, if you're a cannabis person, you're telling a story to the world, very often, like, you'll be like, oh, let's talk about what kind of nutrients we're going to be using in the next. It's like, no, nobody cares. Nobody wants to, you know what I mean? It's like, you guys care. There's a certain audience for that kind of stuff, right? But that's like, you know, I think Kate was saying before, that's like people who are already turned, right? That's like an audience that already buys into your shit. So, like, really kind of angle your content to be you know, what is the average person going to want to consume? Like, the triumph of Bong Appetit is not that potheads watch it, but that they watch it with their moms. You know what I mean? Because, like, what you're doing is you're giving someone a tool of content or a product or whatever it might be, and you're helping them hand that to someone else and change their mind with it. That person becomes a little ambassador for you. I think, like, the Humboldt pen, for example, you know, Derek's product is a great example of that, right? And in that, yeah, just like, it doesn't take a lot of money and it doesn't take genius to make content that people are going to watch and consume. It just takes a little bit of thought, empathy with your audience and knowing what they want, and make it good content in the end, because these are still shows. Just because they're about pot doesn't mean people are definitely going to watch them. Make your shit interesting. You know what I'm saying?